The morning of October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar in the Philippine Sea, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato and watched something that should not have existed. Through the haze of gun smoke and the confusion of surface action, American aircraft carriers appeared on the horizon. Not the fleet carriers his intelligence reports had carefully tracked. Not the veterans of Coral Sea or Midway whose movements Japanese naval intelligence had painstakingly documented throughout 3 years of war. These were different ships, new ships, ships that had not existed in any American order of battle 6 months prior. Kurita had studied the composition of the American Pacific Fleet with the meticulous attention that characterized Japanese naval planning. He knew the names of every American carrier, their deployment patterns, their estimated construction schedules. The intelligence staff of the combined fleet maintained detailed tracking boards showing the location and status of every significant American warship. And yet here, off Samar, American carriers launched strike after strike against his force from ships that appeared to have materialized from nowhere. The engagement itself would pass into history as the Battle off Samar, a desperate action where American escort carriers and destroyers somehow turned back the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since Leyte Gulf began. But for Kurita and the officers around him, something else was happening beyond the immediate tactical crisis. They were confronting evidence of an industrial capability so vast, so incomprehensible, that it challenged every assumption upon which Japanese war planning had been based. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The question that would haunt Japanese admirals through the final months of the Pacific War was forming in that moment off Samar, though few would speak it aloud. How many carriers did the Americans possess? More critically, how fast could they build them? The answers, when they finally understood them fully, would reveal not just a gap in industrial capacity, but a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of the war they were fighting. This is the story of how Japanese naval officers, trained in the most rigorous naval academy in Asia, veterans of victories from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, came to understand that they had entered a war against an opponent whose industrial capacity exceeded their most pessimistic estimates by orders of magnitude. It is the story of the Essex-class carrier, a ship that appeared in American service with such relentless regularity that Japanese intelligence officers initially refused to believe their own reports. And it is the story of the psychological unraveling that occurs when professional military men realize that courage, skill, and tactical brilliance cannot overcome an opponent who can simply build faster than you can sink. The central irony was this. Japanese naval planners had predicted American industrial strength would be formidable. They had warned their own government that a protracted war with the United States would be economically unsustainable. They had been right in their predictions. They had simply failed to imagine how right they were. When Japanese admirals finally comprehended the true scale of American shipbuilding capacity, when they understood that Essex-class carriers were appearing in the Pacific at intervals measured in weeks rather than years, the realization carried implications that extended far beyond naval tactics. It meant that every strategic calculation that had guided Japanese war planning since 1941 had been based on assumptions that were not merely incorrect, but catastrophically, fatally optimistic. To understand the shock that Japanese admirals experienced when, confronting American carrier production, one must first understand the supreme confidence with which Japan entered the Pacific War. This confidence was not mere arrogance or cultural superiority. It was built on genuine achievement, careful study, and rational analysis of observable facts as they existed in 1941. The Imperial Japanese Navy in December 1941 represented the culmination of decades of focused national effort. Following the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japan had committed itself to building a modern military that could compete with Western powers. The Navy received particular emphasis, as Japan's island geography made naval power essential to national security and regional influence. By the 1930s, the Japanese Navy had achieved technological parity with, or superiority, over any potential opponent in several critical areas. Japanese naval aviation had developed with particular sophistication. The carrier strike doctrine that stunned the world at Pearl Harbor was not improvised or copied from Western models. It represented original Japanese tactical thinking, refined through years of training and realistic exercises that prepared pilots and planners for the coordinated complexity of carrier operations. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu that struck Pearl Harbor were not merely ships. They were platforms for a tactical system that Japanese aviators had perfected to a degree that no other navy matched in 1941. Japanese torpedo technology exceeded that of any other nation at war's outbreak. The Type 93 long-lance torpedo could strike targets at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, while carrying a warhead of over 1,000 pounds. American torpedo doctrine in 1941, by comparison, relied on weapons that frequently failed to detonate and lacked the range or speed of Japanese designs. This technological edge was not theoretical. It had been proven in night surface actions where Japanese destroyers and cruisers achieved results that seemed impossible to American commanders trying to explain their losses. Japanese optical technology produced rangefinders and binoculars of exceptional quality. Japanese night vision training created lookouts who could detect targets in darkness at ranges that American sailors found difficult to credit even after experiencing it in combat. These advantages were real, measurable, and repeatedly demonstrated in action during the first year of the Pacific War. They formed part of the foundation for Japanese confidence that quality could offset quantity in a protracted naval conflict. The strategic calculation that led Japan into war with the United States was based on cold assessment rather than wishful thinking. Japanese planners understood they could not match American industrial capacity in absolute terms. The basic economic statistics were clear. The United States produced approximately 7 times more steel than Japan annually. American oil production exceeded Japanese-controlled oil resources by factors that made meaningful comparison almost absurd. Japanese war planning documents from 1941 explicitly acknowledged these disparities, but Japanese strategists believed these material disadvantages could be offset through several mechanisms. First, they calculated that American public opinion would not sustain a protracted war in the Pacific if casualties mounted and progress seemed slow. Second, they believed that early decisive victories would create a defensive perimeter that American forces would find prohibitively costly to break. Third, they assumed that American industrial capacity, however large in theory, would be divided between multiple theaters and would require years to convert from civilian to military production. The Japanese assessment of American industrial potential was simultaneously sophisticated and fundamentally inadequate. Japanese observers had studied American manufacturing capacity carefully. Naval attaches had toured American factories. Intelligence reports documented the scale of American automobile production, steel output, and shipbuilding infrastructure. The numbers were available, and they were staggering by Japanese standards. What Japanese planners failed to anticipate was not merely the scale of American industry, but the speed and efficiency with which it could be redirected toward military production. American shipyards in 1941 were building merchant vessels using techniques that emphasized standardization, modular construction, and assembly line methods borrowed from automobile manufacturing. These methods would prove revolutionary when applied to warship construction. The Essex-class carrier program emerged from pre-war American naval planning that had identified the aircraft carrier as the decisive weapon system for Pacific operations. Design work began in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, but the pace of construction accelerated dramatically once war began. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, was laid down in April 1941 and commissioned in December 1942. This construction time of roughly 20 months was already impressive by international standards, but it represented only the beginning of what American shipyards would achieve. American shipbuilding capacity in 1942 included facilities on both coasts with deep water access, heavy lifting equipment, skilled labor forces, and most critically, access to unlimited raw materials. The Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Newport News Shipbuilding, New York Naval Shipyard, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, and Fall River Shipyard on the east coast were joined by Mare Island, Hunters Point, and Puget Sound on the west coast. Each facility could construct the largest warships afloat. Each had access to steel mills, engine manufacturers, and electronics suppliers within efficient transportation networks. The Essex-class design itself reflected American industrial philosophy. The ships displaced approximately 27,000 tons standard, carried over 90 aircraft, and could sustain speeds exceeding 33 knots. But beyond these basic performance parameters, the Essex design incorporated features that facilitated rapid construction. The hull used standardized sections that could be prefabricated in multiple locations and assembled at the final shipyard. The machinery arrangements used components that multiple manufacturers could produce simultaneously. The weapons systems relied on proven designs already in mass production rather than requiring new development. American procurement planning for the Essex-class demonstrated industrial thinking on a scale that had no peacetime precedent. The Navy ordered 9 Essex-class carriers in 1942 alone. Another 11 were ordered in 1943. This was not cautious expansion based on tested prototypes. This was commitment to mass production before the first ship of the class had even completed sea trials. The confidence this represented was born from American experience with mass manufacturing in industries from automobiles to agricultural equipment. American planners understood that their industrial system could produce complex machines in quantities that rendered individual unit cost almost irrelevant compared to total output. Japanese intelligence officers tracking American naval construction in 1942 and early 1943 reported the Essex program to their superiors with increasing urgency. But the reports faced institutional skepticism. The idea that America could complete fleet carriers at intervals measured in months rather than years seemed to violate basic assumptions about shipbuilding complexity. Carriers required specialized construction techniques, complex machinery installations, and intricate electronics systems. Surely such ships could not be built like automobiles rolling off an assembly line. The first Essex-class carrier to enter combat was USS Essex herself, arriving in Pearl Harbor in May 1943. She was followed by USS Yorktown in April 1943, USS Intrepid in August 1943, and USS Hornet in November 1943. By the end of 1943, 7 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned into the United States Navy. This represented more fleet carrier tonnage added to American service in a single year than Japan had possessed at the start of the war. The construction intervals became progressively shorter as American shipyards refined their processes. USS Lexington, laid down in September 1941, was commissioned in February 1943, a construction time of 17 months. USS Bunker Hill, laid down in September 1941, commissioned in May 1943, took 20 months. But USS Hancock, laid down in January 1943, was commissioned in April 1944, completing in 15 months. USS Ticonderoga, laid down in February 1943, commissioned in May 1944, also achieved a 15-month construction cycle. These were not simple vessels. Each Essex-class carrier was over 800 feet long, displaced 27,000 tons, and contained machinery producing 150,000 shaft horsepower. The ships carried 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns in 4 twin and 4 single mounts, dozens of 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons, sophisticated radar systems, complex damage control arrangements, and aviation fuel storage and handling systems that required extraordinary safety measures. The electrical systems alone on an Essex-class carrier were more complex than most destroyers possessed in their entirety. American industry achieved this construction tempo through systematic application of mass production principles. Newport News Shipbuilding developed prefabrication techniques that allowed major hull sections to be constructed in enclosed shops, protected from weather, by specialized work crews, who repeated identical tasks across multiple ships. These sections were then moved to the building ways where they were assembled into complete hulls using massive cranes and precise alignment procedures. The machinery plants were manufactured by specialized firms. Westinghouse and General Electric produced the turbines. Foster, Wheeler, and Babcock and Wilcox supplied the boilers. Each manufacturer produced multiple identical units simultaneously, creating inventory that allowed ships to be completed without waiting for custom machinery. The standardization extended to weapons systems. The 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun, mounted on Essex-class carriers, was identical to weapons installed on destroyers, cruisers, and battleships throughout the fleet. Ammunition was interchangeable. Spare parts could be transferred between ship types. Training for gun crews could be conducted using simulators that replicated systems across the entire fleet, rather than requiring ship-specific instruction. This standardization was not merely convenient. It was essential to maintaining such a large fleet in combat across the vast distances of the Pacific. Japanese intelligence officers in neutral countries attempted to track American carrier production through published sources, shipping news, and observations by agents in American ports. The reports they compiled and transmitted to Tokyo documented an industrial achievement that seemed to defy reasonable extrapolation from pre-war American shipbuilding capacity. American yards had completed 2 fleet carriers in 1941, 1 in 1942, and 7 in 1943. The projection for 1944 suggested at least 8 more Essex-class carriers would commission, along with numerous light carriers and escort carriers being produced in staggering numbers. The escort carrier program represented another dimension of American shipbuilding capacity that Japanese planners had not anticipated. These smaller carriers, built on merchant ship hulls, were being completed at intervals measured in weeks. Kaiser Shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, was launching escort carriers at a pace that exceeded 1 per month during peak production. These ships, while less capable than fleet carriers, could conduct anti-submarine patrols, provide air cover for amphibious operations, and ferry aircraft across the Pacific. They freed fleet carriers for offensive operations while providing air power in secondary theaters. By mid-1944, American carrier strength in the Pacific included not only the new Essex-class fleet carriers, but also Independence-class light carriers built on cruiser hulls, numerous escort carriers, and the surviving pre-war carriers that had been repaired and modernized. Task Force 58, the main American carrier striking force, operated with Essex-class carriers as its core, typically deploying 4 to 6 fleet carriers, plus supporting light carriers in each operation. This force represented more carrier aviation capability than Japan had possessed at the height of its power in 1942. To comprehend the psychological impact on Japanese naval officers observing American carrier production, one must understand the constraints under which Japanese industry operated during the same period. Japan's shipbuilding capacity in 1944 was not merely smaller than American capacity in absolute terms. It was constrained by material shortages, labor limitations, and strategic vulnerabilities that made comparison almost meaningless. Japanese steel production in 1944 had declined from pre-war levels due to raw material shortages. Japan lacked domestic iron ore and coking coal in quantities sufficient for sustained steel production. Pre-war, these materials had been imported from Manchuria, Southeast Asia, and even the United States. By 1944, American submarines had made shipping routes from Southeast Asia increasingly dangerous. Ore carriers that did reach Japan often carried reduced cargoes to avoid submarine hunting areas or were sunk before completing their voyages. The steel that did reach shipyards was often of inferior quality compared to pre-war production due to reduced alloy content and improvised smelting processes. Japanese shipyards themselves faced labor shortages as the war consumed manpower. Skilled workers were drafted into military service or reassigned to aircraft production, which received priority for remaining skilled labor. The workers who remained in shipyards were increasingly elderly men, women with minimal training, and forced laborers from occupied territories who lacked the skills or motivation to maintain pre-war productivity standards. Training programs that had once required years to produce skilled shipfitters and welders were compressed to weeks, producing workers who could perform basic tasks but lacked the expertise to solve complex problems or maintain quality standards. Japan's carrier construction program during the war reflected these constraints. The carrier Taiho, Japan's most modern carrier at the time of its commissioning in March 1944, required over 3 years to complete. The ship incorporated armored flight deck protection and sophisticated damage control features that made it theoretically more survivable than American carriers. But Taiho was sunk by a single American submarine torpedo in June 1944, 3 months after commissioning, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The loss represented not merely a tactical defeat, but the destruction of years of scarce industrial capacity that could never be replaced. Japan converted 3 Yamato-class battleship hulls to carriers during the war. Shinano, the largest carrier ever built to that point, was converted from the 3rd Yamato-class battleship hull. The conversion required 2 years and consumed resources that might have built multiple smaller vessels. Shinano was sunk by the American submarine USS Archerfish in November 1944, 10 days after commissioning, while conducting sea trials. The ship had not yet received its full air group or completed crew training. 3 years of construction effort and irreplaceable materials were lost in a single night to a weapon system, the submarine, that American industry was producing at rates Japan could not counter. Japanese carrier pilot training faced similar resource constraints. Pre-war Japanese naval aviation training had been extraordinarily rigorous, producing pilots with hundreds of flight hours before they reached operational squadrons. By 1944, fuel shortages forced severe reductions in training flight time. Pilots reached combat units with barely adequate flying skills and minimal gunnery or tactical training. The experienced pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had dominated the skies over the Pacific in 1942, were largely dead by mid-1944, lost in battles from Midway to the Philippine Sea. Their replacements could fly aircraft but could not match American pilots who received fuel-unlimited training in the United States before deploying to the Pacific. Japanese industry attempted to compensate for quantitative inferiority through technological innovation. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, a rocket-powered suicide aircraft, represented an attempt to create a weapon system that could overwhelm American carrier defenses through speed and surprise. But even suicide weapons required aircraft to carry them within range of American task forces, and by 1944, Japanese conventional aircraft increasingly could not penetrate American fighter defenses to deliver specialized weapons. The strategic situation Japan faced by 1944 was not merely difficult. It was geometrically worsening with each passing month. American industrial production was accelerating while Japanese production declined. American pilot training was producing skilled aviators in large numbers, while Japanese training programs degraded. American logistics could support fleet operations across the Pacific, while Japanese forces struggled to maintain supply lines to garrison forces. The material disparity was not narrowing through Japanese effort or innovation. It was widening inexorably as American industrial capacity reached full war production, while Japanese capacity collapsed under the weight of blockade, bombing, and resource exhaustion. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The moment when Japanese naval commanders fully comprehended the scale of American carrier production arrived during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. This engagement, remembered in American naval history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, represented the collision between Japanese assumptions and American material reality in its starkest form. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet during the battle with 9 carriers. The fleet carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, and 6 light carriers. This force represented virtually every operational carrier Japan possessed. The American Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance deployed 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, and over 900 aircraft. The numerical disparity was severe, but what made the situation truly catastrophic for Japan was the quality disparity in pilots and the sustainability of losses. The battle began on June 19, 1944, when Ozawa launched multiple strikes against American carriers. He believed were fewer in number and closer to his position than intelligence indicated. Japanese aircraft flying from carriers struggled to locate American ships through sophisticated American radar-directed fighter interception. American Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters, vectored by fighter direction officers watching radar displays, intercepted Japanese strikes far from the American fleet. The resulting air combat was devastatingly one-sided. American pilots, most with over 300 hours of training before reaching operational squadrons, engaged Japanese aviators, who had received minimal training due to fuel shortages. The Americans flew aircraft that were rugged, well-maintained, and equipped with reliable radios. Japanese aircraft were often poorly maintained due to parts shortages, and many Japanese pilots flew without functioning radios due to equipment failures. The combat became systematic destruction rather than battle. American fighters shot down Japanese aircraft at ratios exceeding 10-1 in many engagements. By day's end, on June 19th, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, along with irreplaceable experienced pilots and the partially trained replacements who had been committed to compensate for earlier losses. American losses numbered fewer than 30 aircraft, most to operational accidents rather than combat. The disparity was so severe that American pilots began referring to the engagement as a turkey shoot, comparing it to hunting defenseless game birds. Admiral Ozawa, aboard the carrier Zuikaku, received reports throughout the day that documented the destruction of his air groups. But the most devastating realization came not from the battle itself, but from intelligence reports compiled during and after the engagement. American radio communications, intercepted by Japanese listening posts, referred to carrier designations that did not match any carriers in Japanese intelligence files. American pilots called out carrier names and hull numbers that Japanese records indicated should not yet exist. References to Wasp and Hornet appeared in intercepts, yet Japanese intelligence knew these carriers had been sunk in 1942. The Americans were apparently using the names again for new ships. The truth that Japanese intelligence officers were forced to confront was that American carriers appearing in the Philippine Sea included Essex-class ships that had been commissioned within the previous 6 months. USS Hornet, present at the battle, had commissioned in November 1943, 7 months earlier. USS Wasp had commissioned in November 1943. USS Bunker Hill, commissioned in May 1943, was barely 13 months old. These were not veteran ships carefully preserved through years of war. These were new construction, completed and deployed to combat operations within timeframes that Japanese shipyards required merely to lay keels. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received Ozawa's reports in Tokyo and consulted with his intelligence staff regarding American carrier strength. The briefing he received documented American carrier production with figures that seemed to defy credibility. Intelligence estimated that America would commission 8 Essex-class carriers during 1944 alone, plus numerous light carriers and escort carriers. Japan, by comparison, would complete no new fleet carriers during 1944. The naval balance was not merely unfavorable. It was approaching mathematical impossibility for Japanese forces to contest American naval supremacy through any conventional means. The psychological impact of the Battle of the Philippine Sea on Japanese naval leadership extended far beyond the immediate tactical defeat. Admiral Ozawa had lost the majority of his carrier air groups, but more fundamentally, he and his staff had been forced to confront evidence that the war was unwinnable through any naval strategy Japan could implement. The American carrier force that had annihilated Japanese naval aviation in June 1944 would only grow stronger in subsequent months. While Japanese carrier aviation could not be rebuilt with available resources and time, Japanese naval intelligence compiled detailed assessments of American carrier production following the Philippine Sea battle. These reports circulated among senior officers and planning staff, documenting with bureaucratic precision the industrial catastrophe Japan faced. By August 1944, American carrier strength in the Pacific included 11 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and over 70 escort carriers. Japanese carrier strength consisted of 6 operational carriers, several so depleted of aircraft and pilots that they functioned primarily as aircraft ferries rather than combat vessels. The intelligence reports noted that American carrier production showed no signs of slowing. USS Antietam would commission in August 1944. USS Shangri-La would follow in September. USS Lake Champlain in October. USS Bonhomme Richard in November. Each ship arrived in the Pacific fully equipped, fully manned, and carrying air groups of 90 or more aircraft flown by pilots with extensive training. Japanese carriers that survived combat faced chronic shortages of aircraft, fuel, and trained pilots. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force, operated with fewer than 40 aircraft in October 1944, less than half its design capacity, because Japan could not produce replacement aircraft or pilots at rates sufficient to maintain full air groups. Admiral Toyoda and the combined fleet staff confronted a strategic problem that admitted no conventional solution. American carrier task forces could operate with impunity throughout the Western Pacific, supporting amphibious landings, striking Japanese bases, and intercepting any Japanese naval forces that attempted to contest American advances. Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized decisive battle as the path to victory, but decisive battle required the ability to concentrate forces and achieve local superiority. American carrier production had made such concentration impossible. Any Japanese fleet that concentrated would face American carrier forces of equal or greater strength, supported by logistics that allowed sustained operations far from home bases. The kamikaze program that emerged in October 1944 represented acknowledgement that conventional naval aviation could no longer contest American forces effectively. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, organized the first official kamikaze units in October 1944, after concluding that conventionally armed and piloted aircraft could not penetrate American carrier defenses in sufficient numbers to achieve meaningful damage. Suicide attacks using aircraft as guided missiles offered the possibility of overwhelming American defenses through numbers and eliminating the need for pilot recovery, which required carriers that Japan no longer possessed in adequate quantities. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated the complete collapse of Japanese naval power as a strategic force. Admiral Ozawa commanded Japanese carriers during the battle, but his 4 carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, operated with only 116 aircraft total among them. Ozawa's role in the battle was to act as decoy, luring American carriers north while Japanese battleships attempted to attack American invasion forces at Leyte Gulf. The plan acknowledged implicitly that Japanese carriers could no longer function as offensive weapons. They had been reduced to bait, sacrificial units whose loss was acceptable if it created opportunities for surface forces. American carriers in the battle included 8 Essex-class fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, operating over 1,000 aircraft. When American pilots discovered Ozawa's force on October 25, 1944, they sank all 4 Japanese carriers in a series of strikes that met minimal opposition. Zuikaku, the last Pearl Harbor veteran, sank that afternoon, marking the symbolic end of the carrier force that had achieved such stunning victories in 1941 and 1942. The ship's loss represented not merely tactical defeat, but the extinction of Japanese naval aviation as a coherent fighting force, capable of contesting American operations. Japanese understanding of American industrial capacity came too late and too incompletely to influence strategic decision-making in ways that might have altered Japan's approach to the war. The evidence of American carrier production that became undeniable by mid-1944 had been available in fragmentary form much earlier, but institutional resistance to accepting unwelcome intelligence had delayed recognition until the strategic situation had become irretrievable. Japanese pre-war intelligence regarding American industrial capacity had been surprisingly accurate in absolute terms. Naval attaches had correctly reported American steel production figures, shipbuilding capacity, and manufacturing capability, but these figures had been interpreted through assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed that American industrial conversion from civilian to military production would require years, that American public opinion would not sustain casualties required for Pacific offensive operations, and that early Japanese victories would create strategic conditions favoring negotiated settlement rather than total war. Each assumption proved false, but institutional structures within Japanese military planning made systematic reassessment difficult. Intelligence officers who reported evidence contradicting official strategic assessments faced professional consequences. Reports suggesting American production exceeded expectations were sometimes dismissed as enemy propaganda or defeatist thinking. The culture of Japanese military planning emphasized offensive spirit and confidence in ultimate victory, characteristics that served poorly when realistic assessment required acknowledging strategic failure. By the time Japanese leadership fully accepted that American carrier production had made conventional naval victory impossible, Japan had already committed to strategies that assumed naval parity could be achieved through attrition and superior fighting spirit. The decision to fortify island garrisons throughout the Pacific, to contest every American advance regardless of cost, and to expend remaining naval and air forces in battle rather than preserving them for defense of the home islands, all reflected strategic thinking that had not adjusted to industrial realities. The appearance of Essex-class carriers at 6-week intervals during peak production represented more than numerical superiority. It represented a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached industrial warfare. American strategy assumed that production capacity was the decisive factor in modern war, that properly organized industry could produce military equipment in quantities that rendered individual tactical defeats irrelevant to strategic outcomes. Japanese strategy, evolved from a military tradition emphasizing spirit, skill, and willingness to sacrifice, had not fully incorporated industrial capacity as the primary determinant of victory in mechanized warfare. American strategy in the Pacific after mid-1944 reflected confidence born from overwhelming material superiority. Operations were planned and executed with the assumption that losses could be replaced, that damaged ships could be repaired or replaced, and that numerical superiority allowed acceptance of tactical risks that would be unacceptable for a force operating at the margins of sustainability. American carrier task forces operated aggressively, accepting combat losses because replacement carriers were already completing construction in American shipyards. Japanese strategy increasingly reflected the desperation of forces operating without hope of reinforcement or replacement. Aircraft were expended in kamikaze attacks because conventional tactics could not achieve results, and because replacement aircraft would not arrive in meaningful numbers regardless of losses. Ships were committed to operations with full knowledge that losses could not be replaced, because allowing American forces to operate unopposed would produce strategic defeat equally certain as tactical destruction. The calculus of desperation replaced rational strategic planning, as Japanese forces fought primarily to delay inevitable defeat rather than to achieve attainable victory. The human cost of this industrial disparity manifested in Japanese casualty rates that reflected the hopelessness of their strategic position. Japanese naval aviators in 1944 and 1945 died at rates that exceeded 90% in many units. Replacement pilots arrived with barely adequate training and survived an average of only a few missions before being killed or so badly wounded they could not return to combat. Japanese naval personnel aboard surface ships faced similar odds, as ships sortied on missions that were essentially suicidal, designed to inflict maximum damage before inevitable destruction, rather than to return safely to base. The story of Japanese admirals witnessing American Essex-class carriers appearing at intervals they had believed impossible reveals fundamental truths about industrial warfare that extend beyond the specific circumstances of the Pacific War. The conflict between Japan and the United States was decided not primarily by tactical skill, strategic brilliance, or fighting spirit, though all these factors influenced specific engagements. It was decided by industrial capacity, by the ability to produce weapons, train personnel, and sustain operations across vast distances over extended time. Japanese naval officers had entered the war as professionals trained in the world's most rigorous naval academy, veterans of successful campaigns, heirs to a naval tradition that had defeated Russia and established Japan as a major power. They had studied American capabilities, had warned their government about American industrial potential, and had planned their strategy around assumptions they believed realistic. Their failure was not ignorance or incompetence. Their failure was inadequate imagination regarding what American industry could achieve when fully mobilized for war production. The Essex-class carrier program represented American industrial philosophy applied to naval warfare. The ships were not individually superior to Japanese carriers in every dimension. Japanese carriers like Taiho incorporated armored flight decks and damage control features that made them theoretically more survivable than Essex-class ships. But Taiho required 3 years to build and was sunk within months of commissioning. America built Essex-class carriers in 15 to 20 months and built them in numbers that made individual ship losses strategically acceptable. The question was not which ship was better in isolation. The question was which nation could sustain production and operations over years of total war. The psychological journey of Japanese admirals from confidence through doubt to recognition of defeat parallels the experience of military professionals throughout history who have confronted the reality that courage and skill cannot overcome fundamental material inferiority. German officers on the Eastern Front in 1944 faced similar realizations as Soviet production overwhelmed German forces through sheer quantity. British officers in earlier wars had imposed similar realizations on opponents who discovered that control of industrial production and sea lanes made British forces effectively inexhaustible. The specific irony of Japanese admirals counting American carriers and realizing nothing, knowing nothing, that could alter their strategic situation reflects the tragedy of wars fought beyond the point where victory remains possible. By mid-1944, Japanese naval officers understood they could not win. They understood American carrier production would continue accelerating while Japanese production collapsed. They understood that every battle would be fought at greater numerical disadvantage than the previous engagement. Yet they continued fighting because military culture, national honor, and political reality left no acceptable path to surrender. The Essex-class carriers that appeared throughout 1944 and into 1945 represented not merely ships, but the physical manifestation of American industrial democracy at total war. Each carrier commissioned represented thousands of workers in shipyards, tens of thousands more in factories producing components, millions more in the economic system that supplied materials and food and transport. The ships were products of a system that could mobilize entire continental resources towards single purposes, that could convert automobile factories to aircraft plants, that could train millions of workers in skills they had never possessed before war began. Japanese admirals witnessed this industrial achievement with professional understanding of what it meant strategically. They saw American carriers appearing at intervals measured in weeks, and knew that Japan could not build carriers at comparable rates even if given years and unlimited resources, which they did not possess. They knew that the pilots flying from American carriers had received training Japan could no longer provide its own aviators. They knew that American logistics could sustain operations that Japanese logistics could barely imagine. And knowing all this, understanding defeat was inevitable. They continued fighting because their culture and their duty required it, even as they watched American industrial power make every sacrifice ultimately meaningless. The morning off Samar in October 1944, when Admiral Kurita saw American carriers that should not have existed, marked not the beginning of Japanese recognition of American industrial superiority, but merely one more confirmation of reality Japanese admirals had been forced to acknowledge over preceding months. The carriers were there. More were coming. Nothing Japan could do would stop them. That knowledge, carried by professional officers trained to seek victory through skill and courage, represented perhaps the most complete defeat military men can experience. The recognition that their profession, their training, and their sacrifice could not alter outcomes determined by forces beyond military control. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.